Welcome to Feminine Founder, where we talk all things recruiting, hiring, business, and entrepreneurship. I'm Caroline Pennington, your host. Today, I have Leslie Nydick with me. Leslie is an expert thought leader in conflict, negotiation, and communication. She is an adjunct professor at NYU, where she teaches courses on conflict management, cross-cultural communication, and mediation. And last but not least, she has been named LinkedIn's top voice in conflict management. So welcome, Leslie.
Thank you so much for having me here, Caroline.
So I'd love to hear your story behind how you got into the conflict management and resolution space.
So when I started my professional career, I found myself in the middle of conflict every single day. I was managing real estate design and construction, and I worked at a variety of organizations, everything from Wall Street to publishing to even Radio City Music Hall in New York City. And although all the organizations were so different, they all had something in common. And that was that conflict happens and it was all over. And as uncomfortable as it was to be in the middle of conflict, whether it was with my internal clients, with contractors, and whoever it was, other professionals, I found that I had this knack for guiding communication and seeing the win-wins versus the win-lose. And it intrigued me, and that's what gravitated me towards it. So when I wanted to pivot to being an entrepreneur, it just became natural, like, wow, this is what I need to focus on. And I started as an arbitrator for the stock exchanges here in New York. I was also doing mediation. I was also doing a lot of training. And then, as you mentioned, I was also teaching at NYU, all evolved through my own training. And then now I want to focus on as many people, individuals, teams as possible to get them unstuck from conflict because it's not going away.
You are so right. And I feel like the natural human reaction to conflict is just to avoid it. So should people avoid conflict or should they deal with it head on?
Good question. So you can avoid it. You can even try and swipe it away. And then there's a big but. It doesn't get any better. It doesn't go away. And in most situations, the negative impact actually increases. And this is because we're still working together in the same organization. Even if there's a situation when someone leaves the organization, chances are that conflict or some of the effects of it stay, because conflict between two people rarely stays with the two people. It impacts the team and it impacts other people that are interacting with you. So we all have that initial response. Please keep it away from me. But instead, I've learned and seen it in practice that if we change our mindset about it, and if we think of conflict not as conflict is terrible, conflict is different perspectives, different ideas, different opinions, different ways of doing things. Suddenly, that different isn't as negative. It's like, that's interesting. And then I can treat it as an exploration. I realize there's a lot more emotions in there. But yes, approaching it is the better choice because it doesn't go away and it gets worse and becomes even more difficult to deal with later.
You brought up a good point about the mindset piece. And I feel like with conflict, a lot of people, again, it's easy just to press the stop button and run away. What is your opinion on changing your mindset and viewing conflict as an area of an opportunity to learn and grow professionally or personally?
That's one of my mottos, that conflict is opportunity. I usually don't initially share that because it's too much of a stretch. We have to get there in steps. And I think it's that believe. And what I mean by that is a lot of people will walk in and see me, whether I'm mediating or arbitrating or just consulting on a conflict or helping the team communicate better. No solution. Will come. There's nothing going to happen here. I'm like, well, if you keep on thinking that, you're right. nothing's going to happen here, because that belief keeps the wall up and the obstacles. So we have to believe there's a solution, even when we have no idea what it is. And it seems impossible because we've tried everything we knew. And that's where it changes, when just keep believing there's a solution, even though we haven't found it yet. We're going to get there. And then people's minds open up. And all of a sudden they start hearing things, or they hear it from different perspectives. Oh, that's why you were doing it that way. I didn't understand that. So that's where the huge opportunity is. And the bigger opportunity is not just in that one, the conflict we're dealing with at the moment. We build a framework for renewed communication going forward. And rather than always assuming, oh, you see, they're doing that to be against me. Oh, let me go over and ask the question, how'd you come up with that process? And when you hear it, you start to realize, oh, they're not out to get me. They were just trying something new. And it just changes everything going forward.
I love that you brought that up, the framework for renewed communication, because that will go a long way in the workplace. And as a recruiter over the years, I've seen so many times people looking for new opportunities because maybe they're having conflict with their bosses or their peers at their current work environment. What advice would you give to an employee who's having conflict either with their boss or their peer?
Let's start with approaching the boss. Remembering that the how has a huge significance with the impact on the conversation. So I'm going to share 2 examples to demonstrate the how. You can approach your boss and go, I must talk to you about our problem. Or you could say something like, I'd like some time to chat with you to follow up what we talked about last week. Use the first phrase if you want to sound combative. And if you use the second version, it's more inviting. It even sounds collaborative. And chances are you may even get an immediate conversation. So that how really matters a lot. And the other piece, we've already mentioned mindset, but it is so important because the conversation going forward after that initial invitation still needs to stay in that exploratory mindset, that you want to be curious about why the manager is thinking that way or what they're thinking, because chances are you knew the decision, but not necessarily how they got there. Hey, I know you want us to do it this way. I'd love to know how you got there. And you may hear examples of prior experiences or just assumptions they made. And then it starts to become a conversation. And you can find out your ideas intersect more than you thought. You might find they differ a great deal, but you're hearing something new and you're hearing it from a different angle. So you're learning something about the other person and perhaps even about yourself. And then when it comes to a colleague, I think it's similar. It's always keep dialing up our curiosity. And it can drive us together, even when our ideas are so different, versus keeping us apart. And the other piece, besides the how, so important with how we approach people, we have to think of the time. Listen, they just got out of a difficult meeting. That's maybe not when you want to rush up and say, I must talk to you now. The place, which involves the privacy issue, who else is listening in? Because then that when other people heard that you have to have that talk, that may create a defense that was certainly not intended. And of course, respect. And it's not just respect for someone's title. I just mean everyone. Respect for the humans. I don't care what their title is. Treat people like you'd want to be treated and remember to listen.
Whether or not you're having conflict with your boss or your colleague, what type of timing is appropriate? I mean, should you address it head on and immediately or wait a couple days and process things and de-escalate?
So that's interesting. We even interpreted time differently, which I love. So you brought up another aspect. I was thinking of time of day, but time of how long past the situation. Yeah, you want to be able to, one of the things to de-escalate is to pause. And pausing can be for a moment or many moments. But if you don't say anything, and it's even when it comes to feedback with people, then they assume everything's okay. Maybe they were incorrect. but your behavior and action showed everything is okay. So you're going to get surprised, like, huh, you're bringing up that meeting, that decision we made. How many months ago was that? 8 months ago? And just in that, it creates confusion. So timing, too much delay can be an issue. But what you can do is, I've had this where someone says something unexpected, startling. I don't want to react. I'd rather respond. Wow, what you have to say is important. I need to let this soak in a bit. Let's talk tomorrow. But now I'm letting them know why we're having a delay, and that makes it work. If I just delay it for days and weeks, then you get that shock, like, what do you mean I wasn't doing it the way you liked or wanted? You never told me, and I've had 5 projects since then. So those delays can be really part of the conflict. And indicate it. Hey, you know what? I really do have some questions about what we were doing, that process. I had some other thoughts. I want to talk to you about it, but I need to absorb this, think about it, reflect a bit. So I'll get back to you. Maybe it is a couple of weeks, but now they know, and it won't be like, whoa, why didn't you tell me that? Timing, I was thinking of just within that day. I can't tell you how many people, especially when I was working in government and corporate, I didn't have my coat off, and people were coming at me like, oh, so-and-so did this, or this happened. Okay, I'm just going to hang my coat up first, take a sip of water, and then why don't you come in 5 minutes? So even that, because they don't even realize, and I would say that, like, do you realize, like, I already feel like I have to defend, and you haven't said a word about whatever the issue is.
Conflict management and resolution, such a valuable skill to have within the workplace.
Conflict happens. I haven't found a workplace where it doesn't. It's not going away. There's even some statistics. Myers-Briggs did a survey back in 2008 when they asked employees, how much are you dealing with conflict during your day? Of the group that said often, very often, and all of the time, it was 28%. There were still other people. Everyone else was still dealing with conflict. But those that were at the extreme end. In 2022, just a year ago, they redid that survey. It's now up to 36% saying often, very often, or all of the time. There was minimal percentage claiming they were never dealing with conflict. And that probably was a conflict in itself. So if you want to stand out as a leader, whether you have a title or not, managing conflict not only addresses conflicts, but your effectiveness as a communicator, a facilitator of brainstorming and discussions and conversations, as a problem solver. You'll really set the example for others. And that's why you end up being perceived as a leader, because you are. Because many people don't have these skills because we weren't taught them.
So what are some conflict de-escalation strategies?
Well, the first one you already brought up with this whole idea of pause. In the pause, I'll just remind everyone, it does not have to be just that 5 seconds or a minute to think and reflect and be intentional. It could be many months. You may schedule to talk to someone later in the afternoon. That's really important because you don't want to react to whatever emotions you're feeling and that they were displaying. You want to respond with intention. After that, the next one is how we ask questions. We have to ask questions to learn, not just to confirm our assumptions. So it's better to start with the word how instead of is or why, because those how questions will provide much more information, and it invites information. How did you do that? How did you come up with that process? If you do questions like is, you're just going to get a lot of yes or no's. You're not learning anything. You either confirmed your assumption or, found out it was incorrect. And then the why questions, particularly at the beginning, put people on the defensive. I know when we talk about our why in life, people get excited. But when you talk about the why, like, why'd you do it like that? People get very defensive and they feel attacked. So avoid those, particularly at the beginning of when you're talking to someone. The other one, listen. And we have to listen more. We have to focus on what they're saying, not how we're going to respond, because that's usually what we're thinking about. Or we think about we heard a little something and we're like, oh, I remember a time that happened to me. Let me tell you how to fix that. They didn't finish telling their story yet. It might not be the same. It's them. So it really isn't the same. So we have to just listen. Those are a few top ones. But to top it off, what we have to do is practice these strategies and skills. There's many more, but you always have to pick one. Start with one. And you have to practice them when you're comfortable. Then it's easier to use it when you're in conflict. You can't start when you're in conflict. So what I suggest to people is during your next conversation with a friend or a colleague, by the way, they don't have to know you're doing. Just start intentionally practicing some of these skills. One of them being pause. It can be very uncomfortable to even leave that count of 3. But practice that while you're talking to someone. Listen more, of course, and then ask better questions. But do it again when you're with a friend, when you're with a colleague. It'll start to become a habit. When you're at a meeting, ask better questions, but don't think of them while the other people are talking.
I think that a lot of times, and you can correct me if you've seen differently, conflict happens when people don't feel heard, or they just feel like their boss ordered them to do X, Y, Z. And coming back and actually doing the pause, scheduling the meeting a week later, and then their boss validating, at least that they've heard their employees' concerns or different ways of doing things. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So there's one even change I've done, like with teaching, training, any meetings. It was a habit because I was probably copying what other people did. The meetings, especially with Zoom, the meeting's about to end, or maybe we're past the ending time. And then the meeting leader goes, any questions? Oh, good, no. And then there's an assumption that really nobody has questions. Well, first of all, you weren't even giving different ways for people to ask because some people won't speak up. But asking at the end of the meeting, any questions? No, we got to go to the next meeting. Now I'm going to be late to that one. So even just asking midway, 3/4 of the way, what are your questions? And then leave a pause, a nice long one. And it's amazing what comes up with when you start to go, all right. And then someone's, no, I do have a question. Now, that's still not the only forum that will work because recognizing that everyone's different. And then at the end, go, listen, you know what? I know you have questions. Some of you can email them to me. I'm going to check in with each of you afterward because that's what I hear from team leaders all the time. I don't know why they're not delivering anything I want. And most of the time when we get to, well, what are your expectations? How did you deliver those? Oh, I wrote it in an email. Did you check in? Because clearly 5 people on your team interpreted them differently. So it's no wonder you're not getting what you want. There never was feedback. And you didn't provide them with different ways to ask you the questions and check in with you and clarify and make sure they heard you.
That feedback piece is so important because everybody learns differently and retains information differently. And so you gave a great example of having a pause in the middle of the meeting because you're right. You get to the end of the meeting and no one wants to be late or be that person to ask the question, right?
Yes. Or dare to ask. Like I've been on that side. You know what? No one else is asking questions, so I'm not going to ask mine, even though it's like a burning question. If no one else had it, and it seems so obvious to me. And then when you take that chance and you dare to ask it, then everyone there's going, oh, I was thinking that too. I was afraid to ask. So even to ourselves, like dare to ask, because it really is true. No question is dumb. If you were questioning it, that means that something I said or something they said was not clear. So let's talk about it.
This has been a great conversation, Leslie. I appreciate it. And so as we wrap up, how can our listeners find you?
Oh, well, for sure on LinkedIn, you can look up Leslie Nydick. Also, if you just want to read information from me, check out my blog, Bite Size Strategies, theconflictstrategist.com. It's the strats, and you'll read those. If you'd prefer to just view, my tips, I have a YouTube channel, the Conflict Strategist, with no spaces in between. It's all one word. Feel free to contact me to ask questions from any of those forums, or if you want to engage me. Soon, I'm going to be launching this new service called the Conflict Tune-Up. So if you want to ask me about that, and I just welcome questions. I will guide you or engage you in whatever way you want. So don't hesitate.
Thanks, Leslie.
Thank you.